Yes, as Russell mentioned, Matt Wells, I lead our product marketing and strategy team, former banker, and got to Intralinks by selling a company that I had started to Intralinks that focused in the M&A space. Really excited to have this great panel that we assembled tonight to have a discussion around a study that we just wrapped up that actually was split into 4 reports that really focused on what happens inside of a virtual data room in this term from starting the data room to announcement. So that whole pre-announcement period. And it's actually a follow-up on a study that we did a decade ago, which was the first of its kind, that looked at all of that data and for the first time ever kind of released some information about how long these diligence periods are, how many users are in the data room. And we sought to look at how that has changed and evolved over the last decade since we did that study. Obviously, we had a pandemic, a big trend towards digitization, and really had some really what I think are interesting and unique findings. So before we get into that, I think it'd be great if we could just go down the line with the panel and do some introductions, and then we'll get into the conversation. We'll start with Val.
Yeah, so it's been really great in terms of working with Intralinks. We've been collaborating for more than a decade in terms of research projects. We've been looking at various research questions to investigate. I'm a senior lecturer in corporate finance. I'm also the course director of the accounting and finance degree at Base Business School. And I've been working with Intralinks for more than 10 years in terms of research projects and looking at various questions. And it's been really enlightening in terms of the results and the findings that we have.
Awesome. Over to Dulce.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the great, first of all, the invitation, and great to be here talking about due diligence. And as I was walking from the office here, I was reflecting that has been actually 20 years since I worked for the first time on a virtual data room. And I was a bit taken by that reflection. But I think is really is very encouraging, and it's great that we have, you guys have the benefit of one, real data, second, a long time series, and thirdly, that we are here reflecting on how that data can help on the decision making process. What can we infer looking at the facts, the data, and the researchers, and how we can take better decisions, because at the end of the day, that's what we want to do. So I've been working, as I said, for more than 20 years in investments. I started off after graduating in investment banking and in Portugal, and quickly realizing that I wanted to specialize in infrastructure. So I moved to the principal side, and that's where I've been working for over 20 years out of London. But really, I think the very privilege of working across a number of regions. So I've done deals in most of European countries, really a global career, European countries, North America, some parts of Latin America as well. My current role, I am a partner at Infrared Capital Partners. We are a mid-market player in infrastructure. We manage about 13 billion of equity, and our history goes back 25 years. and across a number of sectors. So we manage institutional capital, pension funds, insurance companies, and a strong focus on renewables or energy, as well as digital infrastructure and some other sectors like transport and social. So great to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
Go over to Niall.
Thanks. Great to be here. My name is Niall Keppie. I'm part of the M&A team at Shell. So we are trying to address the challenge through M&A in our case of how do we provide more energy, cleaner energy to the world. We know it's needed. We find that's not easy. And so part of M&A, we are doing a lot of acquisitions and divestments to support that. I've also been in M&A long enough to remember physical data rooms when they existed, and have been involved in M&A activities across oil, gas, chemicals, retail, and increasingly renewables over the last 5 years, which was really new for us as well. So that's me. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And yeah, I'm Matthew Bowen. I'm our counsel in the Global Corporate Group at Reed Smith. Also delighted to be here, of course, as well. My background, I've been a sort of practicing corporate lawyer for over 10 years now, and with a principal focus on sort of private M&A activity across a wide range of sectors. Reed Smith has a number of sort of strong industry focuses, such as energy, natural resources, transportation, and media. So naturally, my practice area now sort of does develop those quite a lot, albeit, I do have a lot of experience in doing M&A in other sectors as well. A little bit about Reed Smith. We're an international law firm and originally headquartered in the US, with Pittsburgh being our founding office, but we've now grown to have over sort of 27 offices worldwide. Throughout sort of the US naturally, and then Europe, Middle East, and Asia, and that's me.
Thank you. Also a great name, Matt. Val, maybe you could start us off just giving a foundation of the methodology behind the study, what we did, and kind of the approach.
So what we did 10 years ago is we looked at how can we quantify the due diligence process? And the number of metrics that we looked at is the length of due diligence. So how long is the pre-announcement due diligence process? The other aspect was the size of information. So how many files are shared between the different players? And then the size of the files. So we would look at the number of files and the size of the files, the length of due diligence, and that would help us to then identify how does that link to outcomes when it comes to, for example, likelihood of deal succession. So how does that link to the probability that the deal will complete? How does that link to the likelihood that we generate higher value for shareholders? And this is the unique data set that we've been able to acquire with this collaboration with Intralinks. In terms of about 600 transactions. And then based on the more recent evidence, about 900 transactions. And so we've been able to look at the data set with a higher number of observations and more reliable outcomes to determine the outset. And so that has been one of the key contributions. And then more so in terms of that it's a meta data set, so we haven't looked at any confidential data, but it's more like average and long-term general outcomes in terms of what are the implications that can help us to make better decisions for.
Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the things that you mentioned that we looked at 10 years ago and then looked at again, in this most recent study was the average length of due diligence in that pre-announced period from the time a data room opens to the time a deal is announced. And 10 years ago, that length of time was 124 days. And in this most recent study, the average length of time, in that pre-announcement period has expanded pretty considerably to 203 days. Dulce, I'm curious, with your experience in many due diligence processes across your careers, if you look at those two numbers from those two studies, does that make sense to you based on how the world has evolved and how diligence has evolved? And what do you think has caused most of that expansion?
In my view, I think recently the due diligence timeframes have expanded. Indeed, I think the more than 6 months is probably twice as much as a deal should be in terms of due diligence timeframe to have confidence that it will happen, it will close. Yeah. So I think ideally you want to keep the key ingredients for success on an M&A deal. One is keeping the competitive tension. So you need to have quite under control the time frame for due diligence and stick to it. So, one observation I would make as well is that in the current environment with the recent interest rates going up, in terms of fundraising, I think the pace has also slowed. So if you combine these aspects, there has been some disruption in terms of buyer expectations and seller expectations. So therefore, if they're not meeting, it's likely that the transaction and the initial timetable is more likely that will slip. So I would add another aspect that perhaps 10 years ago we wouldn't have, is that there are additional aspects of due diligence, like impact of climate change, for example. That's something that we would not be spending as much time as we are now if we look back even perhaps 5 or 6 years ago. So that's another area of due diligence, and ESG focus, for example, is relatively new as well. So there are indeed certain aspects of additional due diligence work, but in my opinion, I don't think that's what is driving the longer period. I think it's more a function of this disruption in the interest rate, cost of debt going up, cost of equity should go up as well. Sellers are not adjusting their expectations, therefore there are more transactions that come to a bit of a hold point, and then they need to rebalance. I would just add another point that I think in terms of markets, I've seen the US adjusting quicker than Europe. I don't know if you have breakdowns of how that compares, but at least my observations has also been that different markets adjust at different paces.
Interesting point. We did, one of the things that was interesting about this most recent study is that we did isolate the, let's call it the COVID period, right? Everything changed in daily life. Everything changed in M&A too. And what we found was that prior to 2020, deals were taking on average 189 days before announcement in that pre-announcement period. And then from 2020 to 2022, that number shot up to 247. So obviously something happened there. Niall, I'm curious, in what ways did doing M&A change for you during that period, and maybe what habits that have led to that increase in time, maybe stuck with you since then?
Yeah, I think we had some, even before due diligence, there were some immediate changes we found in terms of M&A. And the first one was with counterparties we were interacting. We were used to, in the old days, you'd get together in a room and would build trust by having lunch or going for dinner. And that just went. No, impossible. I think at the beginning, and we weren't used to using video right at the beginning, and we were all on Amazon trying to get webcams, right, and they weren't available. And we found that it was quite tough to build trust with people virtually who we hadn't met if it was just an audio call. So we had a real dip, and I think that extended time, I guess, in diligence, but just extended time in the process to do that. We then found there was a change once everyone got webcams, and that worked. And we had some weird things we felt contributed to more trust with people we hadn't met, because it was suddenly this view like we all had of you're seeing into people's, I'm going to say, personal spaces more. So it wasn't someone sitting in a dark suit in an office, but their T-shirts and their kids and their pets going across the table. And that kind of helped to kind of humanize the things a bit more. And we found that was pretty helpful. And one on that as well is we found doing deals around the world, there were countries where prior to the pandemic, it was just the norm that if you wanted to go work there, you had to travel there, because there was no trust on phones, the audio quality was poor, and that really changed incredibly quickly. So that sped up some of the things that we were doing, particularly in countries where we didn't have teams there. So that was on the counterparty side. We found internally through the pandemic, what also changed is before that, we would have put together deal teams. Who can we find who are the right people who are all in the same location so that they can co-locate, be in meeting rooms, whiteboards, do stuff together? And then COVID took that away, but it meant that we got much more into a habit, and for us that stuck, of having teams which are not necessarily co-located, but are just all over the place. And it's helped us to think about who are really the right person for this deal team in terms of professional capability and diversity of thought and backgrounds and characters. So that's something, it's just becoming the norm for us to work quite virtually, even if some people are in office environments. And I don't think that's going to change, or we're not seeing that changing, even as we are coming back to the office environment. On due diligence, I think in our world, so energy industry, almost everything was already on virtual data rooms. So that we did have I remember a physical data room in 2019. That's the last one I saw. And we said to get this was in India for a manufacturing plant, and they said we have a data room which is open. We said great, we'll send the email addresses, and they said what do you mean? Here's the physical address, right? But that was the last time. So everything was already pretty digital in terms of data rooms. What we did, though, see was, again, for us buying and selling often production manufacturing facilities, the kind of smell test was always important for us to go see the facility, or for buyers to come and look at our facilities. And that was quite a challenge. And we thought initially, well, we can do that. We'll send someone out and take some videos of an oil refinery or a production facility and put that in the data room. And then we got feedback from buyers in that case as we were selling. Yeah, that's nice, but of course you're showing us the good bits, and you're not showing us the bits which are not in good shape. And so we were able to address that with Google Glasses or MS Teams glasses. And so the first time we sold a refinery in Denmark, and the buyer all the way through till after signing the binding agreements had never visited the facility. But they were able to sit in their office location on video screens, and we had then our operators in the refinery, and our buyers were able to say, can you go up those stairs, and can you go closer to that, and can you turn around? So really almost remote controlling the physical due diligence that they were doing in there. So I think in all of that, I mean, that changed how we were doing diligence. I think for us, in all openness, it didn't change very much how we were doing that documentary due diligence in data rooms. A lot of it was more the relationships part and the physical part of the due diligence, which wasn't possible when we were all stuck in our bedrooms on laptops.
Interesting, you mentioned the facility tours aspect, and how do you replace the process of going and inspecting a site. We definitely did see during that period the average size of a data room expand dramatically, because
those MP4 files.
They were doing all of those or management team interviews, and those were all going to the data room because you couldn't do that face to face anymore. So yeah, definitely was commonplace during that time. Want to move over to Matthew and talk a little bit about the legal aspect. I think one of the findings of the length of due diligence and correlation with deal success was this finding of the Goldilocks effect, I think we called it, or the happy medium, which had a nice correlation between deal success and a lower premium paid by the buyer. obviously it's sometimes difficult to balance that and have both. I'm curious, from your standpoint, how do you balance thoroughness of due diligence with also speed to try to achieve an outcome like that?
I think from my experience, it's a case of kind of really trying to be measured in what you're needing to look at. So there's nothing worse than for any kind of management team who's involved in a diligence process receiving, a 35-page information request list that's clearly off the shelf, not tailored to the business, half of which is completely irrelevant if they're, a software startup that's then got 25 questions about environmental liability for their one licensed premises that they have. So I think clearly, trying to be targeted in what you need to know and ask is going to be is in every party's interest. Your client's not going to appreciate you racking up lots of cost on looking at things that are completely irrelevant either. So, or else it's not going to then lead to consternation among management teams of being asked lots of questions that they know have nothing to do with the business. So I think really investing that time in sort of understanding if you're acting on a buy side, for example, what are the real drivers of this business? What makes this tick? What are you really interested in? And from experience in doing deals in that sector, hopefully we can be able to provide some steer as to what we think are sort of risk areas, whether that's regulatory exposure, whatever it may be. So I think it's kind of the combination of those two. I think is sort of a really key thing. Setting sort of very clear, defined parameters as kind of what is the scope of our diligence exercise, rather than sort of reacting to things that are sort of speculatively being uploaded or what have you. Knowing what you're looking at, knowing that you've sort of set an appropriate materiality threshold, because if it's a large scale operation, then the classic example of the water cooler contract, it just doesn't matter, does it? So, I think clear parameters, targeted diligence questions, setting materiality at appropriate thresholds, and just knowing key touch points and risk areas and just keeping that at the forefront of your mind, that should then hopefully lead to the fact that you don't sort of get into drawn out, prolonged diligence questions that cause frustration on all sides, cause deal fatigue to creep in, which then might lead to other factors that do affect value and deal success rates and things like that.
Curious, Dulce, Niall, how cognizant are you of the ever expanding time of diligence in a particular deal, and are you doing things to try to move it along just purely because the diligence piece is taking too long, or is that not necessarily a factor that you see driving a lot of impact?
As I was listening to Matt, I totally agree with the aspect of being, what really matters is key to have that very clear at the start. In all fairness, that's also the role of the deal lead. When you are on an M&A, you need to really know what you're looking for and be very focused on what is your materiality thresholds, what you're looking at, what it matters and what it doesn't. The other aspect is knowing the advisors that you have working with you, and it's critical that you trust, that they can tell you, so to speak, tell you the time rather than, explaining how to make a clock. And which can then, I remember once looking at a data room, and it was a transport deal, and it had literally all the land permits, and this was a transportation long road on the data room. So that was, not a very good sell side data room from that aspect. Obviously, it's easier, but is not very informative. So preparation is key as well when you are on the sell side, that you spend time before you launch the deal, that you can then control the timetable that the buy side will spend on the analysis, on the due diligence, and frankly will make the data room also smaller. These are some observations that I think some aspects that are really critical, but I think that the role of the deal team, the deal lead, making sure that they keep the pace and they have a clear strategy is really critical for making sure that the transaction happen. Matt, I don't know if you wanted me to if I went into the direction you wanted.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, getting that type of real life feedback to the, the sort of general numbers that the study found is exactly what, I'm most interested in. And the next sort of report looked into the impact of deal terms and looked at cross-border deals, public versus private deals, and definitely found a big discrepancy in length of time in that diligence period between, private deals, which took about 125 days on average, and public deals, which took 125 days on average, and private deals, which took about 230 days on average. And, Val, I know when you sort of started to dig deeper into the data, you found that in private deals, there actually ended up being almost 3,000 more files in the data room as compared to public deals, and more than 100 additional users in private deals. Curious whether that surprised you when you started to dig into it.
I think yes and no, in the sense that when it comes to the requirements for providing information to capital markets by public versus private companies, we know that when it comes to public companies, there is the expectation that there's going to be a lot more transparency when it comes to information being shared with capital markets. We have the regulatory requirements out there. And so when it comes to public companies, I think they tend to be larger in size, and we have that expectation that there's going to be more transparency out there when it comes to due diligence. Also, because they tend to be larger, we know that there is going to be more reliance on advisors, external advisors. We know that there's going to be more resource committed to due diligence. And so when it comes to public companies, I think that we do expect that there is this commitment because of the ownership structure, that there are going to be the resource commitment and the regulatory requirements that leads to there being more preparedness. Mm-hmm. And then that's opposed to private companies or potentially smaller companies out there. And I think that really highlights some of the drivers of the findings that we've generated, in the sense that because of the lack of regulatory requirements when it comes to private companies, it is less compared to public companies. The amount of resources that you have to commit is less. Potentially you are relying less on outside advisors, external advisors. So I think that can contribute to this finding that we see that due diligence when it comes to public versus private companies is less in terms of the intensity of information that's required, in terms of less of the length of the due diligence process, and less in terms of the impact on long-term value generation.
And when you take another kind of cut at that data and you look at cross-border deals, whether they're public or private, we found that just the nature of the deal being a cross-border deal adds on average another month to the time in that pre-diligence period. Niall, I'm curious, with your experience working on many cross-border deals in the energy space, how do you attempt to, accelerate that period while also trying, I'm assuming, to balance different local regulations and due diligence around all of that?
Yeah, indeed. Can I just pick up one on the public and private? An additional one that we saw in diligencing public companies as well is less stuff in data rooms, because there's, as you say, more information already in the public domain. So that's stuff we can, but also depending on the jurisdiction, there's less that's allowed to be shared from a public company. And even under NDA, if it's material non-public information, that's difficult. So it's often tougher, but for public companies, it can be, this is what we can give you and that's it. And try and price it. So that's also almost puts like a legal constraint on what we can diligence. On the cross-border ones, yeah, we have, I can understand, no surprise, I think, that it takes longer, more complexity there, as you say, with local regulations. We also have with language is tougher. I think typically we will see if we are selling or others are selling, if there are documents, the original documents are, we tend to all do deals in English, but if the original documents are not in English, typically a seller will not want to provide translations into English, because then they won't want anyone to place reliance on those translations. So then it means either finding people who can read the originals or finding really good translators who can do that. And that's not straightforward. I guess AI in future will help us on that. But yeah, there is more friction there. Ideally, we find people internally who can work across those different countries as well. But then it can often be advisors, then more advisors. So it might be an advisor who's a specialist in one country, but not in the other country. And so more advisors means more coordination and more time to do the diligence as well.
Makes sense. Any other comments on that from those who have worked on some of those?
I suppose from the I guess the law firm angle, I think there's often sometimes if you're doing transactions in quite far-flung sort of jurisdictions, ignoring the obvious time zone differences, but sometimes there's, from our experience, there's a natural sort of, need to, we'll get their due diligence reports, because typically we like to sort of compile it, and say, a client doesn't want 15 diligence reports, usually they want one. So we'll have to kind of get it, compile it, digest it, understand it. That's naturally going to have more Q&A just between lawyers, because we need to understand what the report is saying, try and translate into, okay, well, what kind of contractual protections do we need? What are the real risk areas we're driving at here? How big a risk is this in terms of, how much of an emphasis do we need to place on this in terms of flagging this for our client's attention? That naturally just has more lead time.
Interesting. Want to move on to something else that we looked into as part of this study, and that's really around information control, and specifically how that relates to deal leaks. I'm sure we've all seen some of these deals that leak, and they obviously force the deal timeline to compress. If it's a public company, that has an impact on stock price, and kind of a ripple effect after that. What we found in the study was that the leaks tend to not have any correlation with a virtual data room opening, which you may think. You get a bunch of users in a virtual data room, somebody gets wind of a deal, starts to leak. It actually is much closer to the time of the announcement. So we found that the leak is more correlated with the announcement time period. And we also found that they appear to be intentional, which may be intuitive. Curious, what measures deal makers can take to help minimize the risk of those impacts, and when a leak does happen, how can that potentially even be an opportunity, depending on what position you're in the deal? I can open that up to anybody that has a strong opinion there.
I think the first thing I would say to that is that if you're particularly if you're dealing with a public company, then they would often have sort of a PR firm already engaged. So kind of, whilst ideally the best thing is prevention's better than the cure, no matter what you wish to try and do in terms of the security around your data, if somebody's hell-bent on leaking something, then it's probably going to leak. But I think having a strategy sort of, hopefully it will never need to be used. It's one of those things you'd like to pop on the shelf at the start of the transaction and hopefully never use, but having a clear strategy as to, okay, well, if, scenario play, where's the leak coming from? Is it a sort of speculative inquiry, or is it sort of somebody from, the Times who's saying we're running this tomorrow? You've got one. This is what we're going to say. Any comment when it's probably a little bit more serious. So sort of scenario playing that, knowing kind of how we're going to react, and also knowing, I think, well, what are we going to say? Because I think your line of messaging to your taking the example of a PLC, your line of messaging to your employee group is likely going to be very different to your shareholder group. If, where your focus to your shareholder group is probably going to be, if you're, is going to be on how this is going to be a great sale. This is kind of the financial metrics are going to have more prominence, whereas employees naturally are going to have more focus on, well, what does this mean for me as an employee in this organization? What's the future look like? So I think tailoring your communication strategy to your audience, I think, is also kind of an important thing to have in mind, and a good financial PR firm, of course.
Yeah, it's good advice. Any other thoughts on that topic?
I mean, we put in place lots of things to avoid unintentional leaks, kind of technical behavioral measures. That works pretty well. I agree it's really tough to prevent intentional leaks.
Yeah.
I think something we've had less when we've been buying, but if we are selling, that's typically, again, production industries. So we'll have lots of staff who are involved and are impacted, and their jobs are involved. So that's really sensitive. But typically we'll often, as we get closer with potential buyers and also through management presentations and later, we seek to speak with potential buyers around how important it is that it doesn't leak in their interest as well. Because then if they want to deliver their value thesis in an industry which is also dependent on everyone who's working in that business, then it's really important for them, how do they want to put their best foot forward, and how do they want to show up as the new buyer and motivate and get everyone enthusiastic about the new ownership. And if they don't do that, but it leaks and they're on the other side of the world and they're just on the back foot, that's not in their interest either. So I think that's something where I guess we feel that there can be, from time to time, people will try and play games. But if we can try those who are serious to get to a place that's not only in our interest that things don't leak, but in yours as well, then I think we believe that helps. But yeah, we've struggled to completely eliminate it, as you can also see in the newspapers.
Moving a little bit more towards the role of technology in the M&A process and how that's continued to evolve. Obviously, VDRs, I'm shocked that you were in a physical VDR in 2019, but obviously they're becoming more and more commonplace, to the extent that it's probably in the high 90% of deals have VDRs. And we've seen VDR usage and particularly the users that are part of a VDR grow by 64% from a decade ago. So a lot more parties, a lot more people using the VDR. What would you guys say are and Dulce, I'm curious your opinion first, are sort of the benefits and limitations of these types of technologies as they become more prevalent?
I think so. One driver is how specialized people become in terms of they just doing certain part of the due diligence, and has also in terms of the sophistication, you have more areas to cover and people more specialized. So naturally, you're going to have bigger teams. I think it's also linked to what Niall was saying, that we want to make sure that we have the best people involved. So there will be teams that are maybe located in another region and are just covering that particular analysis because that's where they are experts and they have experience. And because it's now easier to a certain extent, because you're not limited just to the people that are say just based in London. They can be based anywhere in the world. They can be involved in the transaction. So it's actually quite easy to assemble these teams, and the temptation of making these teams quite large is probably high. But then it becomes the work of the deal coordinator and the deal lead. Then it becomes even more important, and you need to make sure that everyone is working towards the same objective. They know what they're solving for, they know the timetable. You probably end up spending a lot of time in coordination meetings. That's the flip side as well. So getting the balance right, I think it's the secret sauce.
Makes sense. And I know we're coming up on time here, but one question I did sort of want to go down the line here before we open it up to Q&A is around AI. You probably knew that was coming, but I think we're all sort of starting to get our feet wet with AI in our daily lives and where its most practical applications are. And M&A is obviously not going to be immune from that, and ideally it's going to be a big benefit, but also comes with some risks and challenges as well. I'm curious, in your case, Val, just your thoughts on where it can be beneficial, and then in the rest of the panel's case, where you may already be using it or experimenting with it, and where you possibly see it going in terms of impacting the process.
Yeah, so I think it's a really good question, in the sense that I've heard from talking to M&A practitioners a lot of excitement about the applications of AI, but there at the same time is a skepticism when it comes to actually bringing AI into the functionalities of the M&A process. So we have this situation where we have a very good understanding of how AI can facilitate the deal process, but are we confident enough to implement it and then to make decisions on the basis of information that's provided by AI? And so that's where I see the big challenge. So where I see a lot of opportunity out there is when it comes to particularly the VDR, the virtual data space, is where we can implement artificial intelligence functionality to help us to, first of all, develop more in-depth insights. So looking at how we can gather information, much more in-depth and detailed information about strategy, valuation. So AI can help us in terms of getting unstructured data. So for example, voice, video, language interpretation of data. And so that can really help us to decipher strategy, valuation, kind of insights. So that's where I see one of the areas where AI can help, particularly within VDR, and like implementing that within the functionalities of VDR. The other one is automation. So one is insight. So AI can help us in terms of depth of information that we can get. But then the other one is in terms of automating, like the reports that we can generate. So for example, automating contracts, automating strategy reports. And so AI can help us to automate tasks that typically are higher kind of labor intense, repetitive level of tasks. And the other area is in terms of forecasting. So when it comes to being able to predict what will be the outcome in terms of regulatory changes, for example, or changes in terms of the technological advancements, changes when it comes to how customers or competitors might react to developments. So AI can help in terms of being able to predict, forecast developments going forward. So I think that when it comes to artificial intelligence, we can think about deeper insights, automating, and then also being better able to forecast how we can generate value from transactions.
A lot of potential there for sure. Curious if you guys have started to experiment with it? Has it become, ingrained in the process yet? Still kind of taking a wait and see approach?
I think we're probably in the latter. We are having we are working with companies at the moment to really explore how can we bring AI into, particularly in our diligence process, because I think as has been touched upon, there is an element of churn. As much as I love due diligence as a corporate lawyer, it can be quite a labor sort of intensive process. So anything that we can bring in that, using the classic example, if we're tasked with reviewing top 50 customer contracts, if there's an AI platform that we can work with to say these are the key touch points, this is what we want, and we can press a button and that can be generated, much more quickly than the 50 hours it would take some of our junior lawyers to do. That's going to be, I think that's in everyone's interest, particularly for clients who we can pass cost benefits on to as well. So I think, that automation aspect, I think, is something that I think would be a really sort of key improvement to diligence process and could really help bring down the timeline of diligence processes as well.
Yeah,
Niall, Dulce?
that's absolutely something we'd like to see more of, and I think that's would be great. Early stages for us, I think we've also had things like if we're putting an early stage video management presentation in a data room, then we'll use AI to do the first transcript that we then manually go through. So, but I would say more time-saving efficiency things, not yet so much going into forecasting and more sophisticated things yet. So looking forward to that.
How about at infrared?
We're starting to use for, say, first drafts of certain reports or certain things that are quite limited in terms of scope. So not really taking it, I would say, not really taking it serious yet. So in a way, just saying, okay, what can you do if we ask this task, and then that was the first draft, was interesting. So I think we're still at this very early stage, not really yet having a real use of it, but I think we are very excited how it can evolve.
It's still early days and interesting to see that everybody's sort of dipping their toe into the water in a different way for proof of future use cases. So I think we have time for a couple of questions, right, Susanna?
Yeah, definitely.
If there are any in the room, we're happy to take those now.
If there is any. We do have a microphone if anyone has a question. So go right at the front.
Yeah, thank you. First, just kind of an observation, which will lead to a question. I was glad to hear Niall here because Niall and I can probably remember the days of PDRs or physical data rooms and virtual data rooms. So first an observation, then a question. One observation, you mentioned about the lead time on deals. And I think VDRs were kind of the trigger for that because they elongated the due diligence process. If we think about the days of physical data rooms, we took in a team, you had a team, a limited time, go in the room, look at the documentation. Due diligence time was very limited. We had to come out with it with a yes, no. Do we want to, on the buy side, make a bid? VDRs opened up to a lot more information. The deal teams became bigger, and we had to point them in the direction of where do you have to look to get us from the what to the so what phase, and so what do we do? So I think that elongated the lead time. Now, question is on AI. I love that when I saw an AI here is the question of the capability of it. Where I saw it is there an opportunity from the panelists for both efficiency and accuracy? Efficiency because I thought, look, with all that information that's going into the virtual data room, how can we point these people as to where they need to look and why? Can you start using, say, large language models or generative AI to look through and say, take either the structured or unstructured data, synthesize it, tell them where to look. The other is, I think, Valeriya, you mentioned it, which is, can you start picking out areas that might indicate something you want to look into, like using supervised machine learning to look at saying, where are the elements of the financials of this transaction odd, or maybe they have patterns or characteristics of things that might be concerning, and call those out. So my whole thing is, look, can it decrease the lead time? Because yes, virtual data rooms have been a double-edged sword. They've elongated the lead time because there's just more information there. Can AI do that? And do you see those two opportunities between, look, synthesizing through large language models and maybe some supervised machine learning to look at finding out, hey, where are the problems? Where do I need to look? Are there problems? Are there patterns or characteristics in the financials I need to look at? So observation, question on those two areas of AI.
Yeah, for me, could absolutely imagine both of those areas in the AI. I mean, interesting that you're already getting into that report synthesis part of it, and also then using it to be able to go through and use the machine learning through there as well. We haven't really started doing that seriously yet, but I think it feels like that will be coming next. I guess it'll be an interesting question also for us, and I don't know if it's for you guys, but how do we find a way to test that? And sort of taking some guinea pig deals, and I could easily imagine the first times we do it, probably almost shadowing it. It feels to me a bit like, well, do you trust a self-driving car, and I'm really not going to have a steering wheel, or do I just? But it will be interesting. I could imagine. I mean, I would be surprised. I think in 5 years' time to have a discussion like this, and we'd still be saying the same thing. I would expect we are going to be a lot further.
Any other questions in the room? And by the way, might know somebody that can help you guys with that too. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you talked about the deal time extending. So why do we think that was, and what do we think we can do to shorten it?
Good question. I've got a few thoughts. I mean, I think there's just, compared to the study that we released a decade ago, which covered the prior 5 years, right? There was a lot less. ESG wasn't a topic. The world, even though it doesn't seem like that long ago, was a simpler place. There was less to diligence. So that's part of it. It was less specialized in terms of the diligence teams and all of the individuals that were part of a virtual data room. And I think, a combination of that plus additional regulations and GDPR and, things that need to be redacted and translated has just all added up to really extend that length of time. What can be done about it? It doesn't seem like it's a toothpaste back in the tube situation. I don't think the world is getting simpler, but I think technology is getting smarter. And I think the conversation we just had around AI will help to, maybe not drastically decrease the time frame of diligence, but as more and more things probably get added to the table to diligence, we'll likely start to at least not see that time expand on a prorated basis. At least those are my thoughts. I don't know.
No, I completely agree. I think, and this gentleman I think you've hit the nail on the head, that there is just more information to review, and we're not going to reverse that trend. I can't ever see that happening, that people are going to start providing less information. So it's how do we review that information more quickly and effectively? And so I think that's where, that's one of the key drivers why I think it's taking longer. I think from a legal perspective as well, there are as a very general sweeping statement, there is greater regulation in the world now than it was 10 years ago. And a sort of very classic example that we see in a lot of deals these days is sort of foreign direct investment regimes on cross-border transactions that are, it's the UK equivalent being the sort of National Security and Investment Act, and seeing how those regimes are now popping up sort of throughout sort of Europe and in other countries. Some of them are sort of very much in their infancy, so people are still getting to know the regime, still trying to work out when it applies. That needs a lot more thought, a lot more collaboration with the applicable regulators, lots more back and forth and Q&A. I think as those regimes become more sophisticated and even the legislation in some of the areas improved, we had a horrendous experience with an Austrian FDI regime recently where people just the lawyers just couldn't tell us exactly whether our transaction fell within it or not, which you probably find very surprising. But just that kind of thing where as that regulatory environment becomes more familiar in these sort of jurisdictions and people become more familiar with working with it, then we will hopefully get through transactions more quickly as well.
I think one interesting observation it'd be really good to know the time it takes. Sorry, it'd be really interesting to know how long it takes the seller to actually populate the data room with the information, and then how long it takes the due diligence teams to then review that documentation. Because then you're going to get a really good understanding where the time is taken. Because personally, from my experience, is that most sellers go into the process not actually being ready, not having all the information to hand. They're either inexperienced or very busy in their working life. So it'd be really interesting to know those two time periods.
I think we can take one last question. Yeah.
Hello, I have one.
Okay.
Infrared, probably. With the announcement of the budget, UK budget, how do you think the impact for the private equity community will be? Very general question, but what's your first read through it, and how much are you still analyzing it, how really it will impact the industry?
Thank you for the question. I'm thinking about, so in terms of I would say that the budget was not something that was, like front of mind or in terms of the radar. Obviously, it's important, but at the end of the day, we are quite diversified in terms of exposure, countries, sectors. I think the drive for better infrastructure is there, but we're not just exposed to UK. I think tax is a big component, but is not something that, when you are investing out of various structures, a global firm, I think in a way, you have different options in terms of how you can structure investments on a global basis. But indeed, it's what is happening at that level does have an impact on how you conduct transactions. I think we agree that the world is not becoming simpler in terms of the structuring of deals. It's quite a big component in terms of the time that we spend on due diligence, which is not something we would do, 20 years ago when we were probably taking a simpler view. I still remember the days of physical data rooms as well. Right at the beginning of my career, I think the first deal was a physical data room, and I remember we had a week to do everything. So I don't remember spending that amount of time just looking, say, for example, at structuring to make sure that we are maximizing or optimizing the best structure for one single investment.
We should have had an example of a physical data room set up outside, so everybody could experience the banker boxes and all of the paper. But thank you guys so much for your time. I want to thank the panel for their time and their insights, and thank all of you for the questions. I believe we still have more cocktails and bites out there, so I'm sure if there are additional questions, happy to answer them outside, but thank you all again.
Yeah, very insightful. Number one, some of the panelists there had direct experience with some of the things I had done in M&A, especially from the buy side. So when hearing from Niall, and then also hearing from Valeriya from Bayes, it was very interesting to hear some of the different things she had said and how data was being used, but especially when I gravitated towards Niall and some of his practical experience and how he used some of the different technology in transactions that he ran.
I thought it was really great. It was genuinely interesting. It was great to have such a varied panel with someone from academia, someone from legal practice such as myself, somebody from a corporate, and then somebody from investment. So yeah, it just couldn't have been a better put together panel as far as I'm concerned. And you got the benefit of that from what they were saying from their different viewpoints.
Key insight I heard was about the lead times. By lead times, it's the amount of time it's taking from, look, here is the deal, to making a decision on the deal, and how that has grown over time. And especially I related it to virtual data rooms. In virtual data rooms, the amount of information is increasing. That means there's just more to look at. We still got the same amount of people in a deal team to look at those, but much more information to look at. So one of the key insights and the questions I asked was about, say, how can we be able to look and digest what's in there with the limited resource I have? And that's why I asked questions about AI. how can AI be used to hopefully make it much more efficient, and also make sure the accuracy of the assessment of what's in there is the same and not decreased.
I think the AI discussion was really interesting, not the least because it wasn't just AI is going to change everything, but there's actually some in-depth discussion about how AI can impact on the efficiency of DD. And there was also some probing questions about why DD is taking so much longer now, and that then took us back to the research that the whole panel discussion started off about. So yeah, it was really valuable. It wasn't just a showpiece, it actually was educative as well.